So I'm going to talk about kind of what's coming down the road, the issues on the horizon. But first I want to start with our lawyer's favorite slide, okay? And basically we're going to talk about some things that we think may be happening in the years to come. And so I'm just saying that whenever you do that, I'm invariably wrong. And if you make any investments or do anything stupid based on what I say, then you're on your own. Okay, so that's just, so you can read it, but that's kind of what it says. So let's start out with some context, and this comes back to some of what Arthur was going to earlier, but I want to look at it a little bit differently. BP just released what we call our Energy Outlook 2035, available on the BP website, and it's similar to IEA and a lot of the other projections of energy use. And kind of in ours, we looked at, okay, what's going to happen now over the next 20 years or so, and you're going to see an average of about 1.5% a year growth. Almost all of that growth is going to come from non-OECD countries, and of that non-OECD growth, half of it's going to come from India and China. Okay, if you look at that, you know, renewable fuels is going to be a big grower, over 6% a year, but then again, it's starting from a very small base, so it doesn't ever really become a big piece, at least in the next couple of decades. Oil and coal will continue to grow. The biggest grower is natural gas at about, just under 2% a year, and it takes a bigger and bigger portion. But the key is that all of these fuels, even the kind of, quote, higher carbon fuels, heavier oils, coal, everything continues to increase. Gas gets more of the share, and renewables get more of the share. But the energy mix, is still going to be a pretty diverse mix. And that has a lot of implications for greenhouse gas emissions, right? So if you look at CO2 growth, again, if you look at it's similar to the energy growth curve. If you look at OECD countries, they're pretty much stable, declining a little bit. You look at the non-OECD growth wedge, it's huge, okay? And so overall, we're saying it's, roughly 29% or 1.1% a year. Policies, see how this is kind of at least the BP view, is that policies are going to continue to tighten. The growth rate of emissions will eventually decline. But, and this is important, if you look at the IEA 450 ppm scenario, the dotted red line says that's what, that's kind of what the pathway you would need to, curve down to meet that. And I guess the BP view is that while we would like for that to happen, and that's, societally that's a great thing to do, but the energy demand that's out there is we just don't see that happening, okay? It's not what we want, but it's what we think will happen. I think you want to look at it from that perspective. Also, too, though, I think one of the things that's important is that kind of the role of energy efficiency, and it was mentioned earlier, and I'm going to get to it again. If you look at kind of worldwide GDP, it comes up, and the energy use, which is the blue line, increases much slower than GDP does, okay? And so as a society, globally, we get continually more efficient, which is a good thing, but it's still not enough to keep CO2 emissions growth, from going, continually higher. And also, if you look at the energy and CO2, that very bottom line, the energy that takes less and less CO2 as you see renewables and gas and the other things I talked about. But again, the CO2, it comes up with economic growth. So I just want to put that context out there that we're in a world that where things are going to continue to move upwards. And so what's the ramifications of that? Okay, that first of all, I think you're going to see, okay, greenhouse gas climate policy are going to continue to evolve. Currently 66, actually I think the number is 62, but you get the idea, have what is called like a flagship law in place where there's a policy, or a regulation or something that speaks to climate or greenhouse gas. Now, in many, many countries, those are pretty ineffective, and they're there more as, I would say for show. In some places, obviously, the EU is a good example where, where there's actually teeth in it. There's places in the U.S. and different market sectors where that's becoming true. And so, but you do see a continually evolving movement towards more and more greenhouse gas regulations in different countries around the world. Cap and trade programs are going to continue to go and expand in scope. The cap and trades in some places so far don't exist all to themselves. There's vehicle standards. There's energy efficiency standard. There's other regulatory tools that accompany them, and we kind of and I think we're going to see more of the same to continue. In the U.S., as based on the climate policy and the just kind of the political situation in the country, for the next while, it's going to be regulatory in nature. EPA kind of using their authority that they've gotten through the Clean Air Act and the Massachusetts versus EPA, the court decision and everything that's followed for that. I think we do see a growing emphasis on energy efficiency. In the EU, you've got the Energy Efficiency Directive. You've got a lot of the NSPS regulations that are on greenhouse gases being talked about in the U.S. have an energy efficiency component, like in refining, as an example. There's probably going to be an energy efficiency component in that. Other places too, we're seeing more and more talk around energy efficiency as a way to do that, as a way to combat climate change. The other thing is you're seeing investor and lender pressures on some of the higher carbon industries will grow. I think that there's a lot of NGOs now that see this as a more efficient pathway than leaning on the government. We're seeing more and more where they're leaning on investor groups and folks that are kind of pulling the strings of the bigger companies and the bigger producers. Kind of with that, seeing more and more on life cycle emissions. For California, you've got the low carbon fuel standard. In Europe, you've got Fuel Quality Directive 7A, where you've got where you're really looking at the total picture of emissions from motor fuels. That has implications, and the implications that come out of that are that more and more we believe that we're going to see pressure on crude producers to get the carbon intensity down, and also natural gas producers, the carbon intensity. So if you've got a thermal crude, or with high thermal content, or in production, or you've got lots of flaring associated with it, the carbon intensity of that goes up, and what can happen then is a low carbon fuel standard type regulation can create a discrimination in the marketplace against those kind of crudes, and so that's going to put pressure back on the upstream eventually. This could happen to really manage flaring and manage the energy usage from the upstream, and becomes less of a theoretical or less of just an isolated calculation where the value chain links together, from an energy standpoint, energy intensity standpoint. Also, you're seeing more attention along the way of consumer products and the consumer product value chain, to where people, and I think this is a European phenomenon more than the U.S., but people are starting to care, okay, what's the carbon intensity of the plastic that my thing I just bought is made out of? My drink container, what's the carbon intensity of this bottle? And things like that. So you're starting to see these are starting to get into consumers' mind. I don't think they're impacting consumer behavior, and I'm not an expert on that. But I think we're starting to see those kind of things enter the conversation. And so, again, that kind of makes it a consumer investor, kind of a little bit of more of a bottom-up movement rather than regulatory action. And so we think about where does this go, and I'm kind of shifting gears here because I want to talk about what does this mean for us. Okay, so we talked about context, we talked about what's going to happen, so what's the so what? What does that mean for companies like mine and others? The big conversation, if you've been in this business here for the last few years, is around this thing we call short-lived climate forcers, which are, generally it's methane, it's black carbon, it's hydrofluorocarbons are the principal ones. And methane, I think, is one of particular things, and this ties into our natural gas conversations earlier. And some of the data Miriam presented, I'm going to look at that data in a little bit different light in just a second. But the thing about short-lived climate force or methane emissions, there's two things that make those prime for regulation. Number one is that they're actually a big piece. Some estimates will say 30% of the global, current radiant forcing or something like that is due to like methane and short-lived climate forcers. So if you were to make a reduction pretty quick, you could get a quick action on climate. The other thing is that there's a whole lot of stakeholders that have a stake in CO2, but not near as many that have a stake in methane emissions. Okay, so you think about the regulated community, the regulated universe is much, much smaller than CO2 because every consumer out there just about has a stake in the CO2 argument. Anybody drives a car. Okay, and so we see that. Okay, so it's easier to regulate within the economy. It can drive near term. Methane and black carbon be the ones, I think, in our industry. Black carbon, especially in the higher latitudes, because the theory is the soot, basically, black carbon is just kind of a form of soot, gets on the snow, makes the snow darker, absorbs more heat, and and you get more melt, and you just get more heat into the system. One of the things we'll talk about, and we're going to get to, is the measurement issues around these are important. Okay. And let's talk about that. If this is a whole bunch of studies, and there's actually more than this, but we picked some to see. Can you hand me my water bottle? We picked some just to kind of for illustration here. Okay, thank you. If there's kind of three ways of looking at emissions, methane emissions. There's kind of three ways you can do this. There's bottom up, which is like the greenhouse gas program, measurement program in the U.S., like Miriam's data. Where people go out and they look at their components and they say, okay, we've got this much emissions, and when we calculate it, there's top down where you look at area ambient methane emissions, and then you try to allocate it back down to the sources, and then then you've also got some life cycle analysis type where you can do an LCA. The takeaway from here is, and the scopes are different from the different ones, but the numbers are all over the map. Okay, and so what we asked the question earlier, what are the kind of the typical methane emissions from your operations? Well, you take an average, and it's somewhere in that 1.5% range probably. But the thing is, and this is something we've talked a lot about, is that policy expectations are important. If you believe in some of those big numbers and you think you're going to get some huge reductions from a reduction program, you may be disappointed if the emissions are actually much smaller. And so before we can have a lot of meaningful conversations on how to go about this, we need to kind of know what the size of the prize is. All right. And so reconciling these is a real high priority. There's a lot of work being done on it. But if you think about what's the conversation going to be in methane in the next several years, that's going to be part of that, is that reconciliation. Then overall, I think if you look at measurement inventories, making sure that we've got the accuracy of the satellite-based flaring estimates, credible emission measurement studies in general, and really what's the role of industry in making sure that this data gets together and we pull this together. So let's talk about, just real quick, what's the road ahead? We think that actions are going to come from a mix of both voluntary and mandatory measures. There are voluntary initiatives like the Global Gas Flaring Partnership, GGFR, Reduction Partnership, Natural Gas Star, Global Methane Initiative will play a role. There's the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which some of you may be familiar with, which was an EPA, actually State Department, the U.S., but it's become a global methane initiative. It's been struggling because they had trouble articulating a a value proposition, but it does look like it's actually getting some traction. And again, then what is the role that industry has? We have to think about that we can't sit back and resist. We've got to be part of this conversation going forward because the stakes are very high, and our job is to make sure we're having the right debate, the right conversation with the right numbers. So that's it. There's my sources, by the way. So thank you.